Welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar, How do Child Tax Credits Impact Labor Supply? My name is Lee Gibson, Vice President of Social Policy here at the Niskanen Center. And it's just terrific to see so many familiar names and faces with us today. We're especially grateful to our colleagues in philanthropy who've made this conversation possible. For those of you new to Niskanen, we are a nonpartisan think tank that works to advance a reimagined America rooted in the ideals of liberal democracy. In these polarized times, our policy scholars bridge political divides by working to build a government that represents the entirety of its people, a culture that embraces diversity and the free exchange of ideas, and an economy that offers opportunity for all. Niskanen's social policy team has long been focused on how child benefits like the child tax credit can help realize this vision. Created in 1997, the CTC provides income support and tax relief to households with children and has been expanded multiple times on a bipartisan basis. Most recently, the American Rescue Plan temporarily grew the credit and expanded eligibility to the lowest income households. And as this audience well knows, the Biden administration included another extension in the Build Back Better agenda. At the same time, some have remained concerned about the credit's potential impact on parents' workforce participation. In spite of multiple recent studies, the issue remains contested. Today, we have a terrific panel to discuss the most recent analyses that are keeping these debates alive. We hope you'll take advantage of the chat function to join the conversation by sharing comments and resources. In addition, we've reserved time for discussion, so please start submitting your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those interested, you can stay current with our terrific policy team here by clicking on the newsletter button on our homepage. Finally, we will be posting the recording on Niskanen's YouTube channel. We hope you can share it with other interested colleagues. Now, let me turn it over to the moderator for today and my dear colleague, Sam Hammond, Director of Poverty and Welfare here at Niskanen, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Lee. It's fun to be on this side of the microphone. Normally, I'm the one on these panels. So I'm delighted today to be hosting an expert panel on the child tax credit and its potential impact on labor supply. As many people know, the child tax credit was expanded as part of the American Rescue Plan in 2021. And among part of the expansion included making the credit fully refundable, which means extending the eligibility to the credit to households with low or zero income. The expansion has been heralded as a sea change among experts in U.S. social policy across the ideological spectrum. However, there's to date little consensus, at least among the DC policy world, about whether its impact on labor supply is negligible, large, small, and whatever the size of the impact, whether that matters from a policy perspective. So, today we're here to help resolve some of that debate and actually bring different perspectives in discussion, because too often we are within our own bubbles and not talking with each other. So today I'm delighted to have on our panel Jacob Bastian, who is an assistant professor of economics at Rutgers University. His research focuses on how public policy can reduce poverty and increase economic opportunity. And prior to moving to Rutgers, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, and most recently authored a working paper titled Investigating the Effects of the 2021 Child Tax Credit Expansion on Poverty and Maternal Employment. We also have Kevin Corinth, who is currently the staff director of the U.S. Congress's Joint Economic Committee. He has served as executive director of the Comprehensive Income Dataset Project at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, was chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, and was a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also the lead author of a recent paper, The Anti-Poverty Targeting and Labor Supply Effects of the Proposed Child Tax Credit Expansion, that appeared last October as part of a working paper series with the Becker-Friedman Institute. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Next, we have Elaine Mogg, who is a senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she studies income support programs for low-income families and children. Before joining Urban, Maag was a presidential management fellow at the IRS and the Government Accountability Office. She has advised congressional staff on the taxation of families with children, higher education incentives in the tax code, and work incentives in the tax code, and was recently author of the brief, Who Has Received Advanced Child Tax Credit Payments and How Were the Payments Used? It's hard to read anything in this literature without stumbling on Elaine's work, so we're also delighted to have her. And lastly, we have Robert Moffett, who almost needs no introduction, but is the Krager Eisenhower Professor of Economics at Johns Hopkins University, a fellow of the Econometric Society, a fellow of the Society of Labor Economists, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and served as chief editor of the American Economic Review, co-editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics, chief editor of the Journal of Human Resources, and much more. I'm having to abbreviate his bio quite a bit. But for our purposes, he chaired the National Academy of Sciences panel to evaluate welfare reform, and most recently was a committee member of the influential 2019 National Academy of Sciences report on, quote, building an agenda to reduce the number of children in poverty by half in 10 years. And among that report's contributions was some modeling on the impact of a child tax credit, matching the description of what was expanded in 2021. So with that, I wanted to open, and I think we'll go with Kevin first, with a very high level question, and I believe you may have some slides. What is the impact of the child tax credit on labor supply, and what does your research show on this issue?
All right, well, thank you. So I do have some slides, and let me go ahead and share those, or at least attempt to do so. All right, can you see my slide, Sam?
Good to go.
Okay, great. So first, let me go back to the actual first slide, and just a couple of disclaimers. So first of all, my views expressed here represent those of myself and do not represent those of any members of the U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee. Also, my remarks here will be based on research in which we were all equal co-authors with Bruce Meyer, Matthew Stadnicki, and Derek Wu, in addition to some follow-up work that I did with Bruce Meyer. So I'd first like to say thank you for organizing the event, and to say that I'm excited to speak alongside some of the foremost experts on how tax policy affects low-income families. In order to determine how changes to the child tax credit would affect labor supply, we have to answer two separate questions. First, how does the incentive to work change? And second, how would workers respond to the changed incentive? My co-authors and I, as I just mentioned, released a paper last fall that showed most experts were getting the first question wrong. We showed that because Build Back Better eliminates the pre-existing CTC, which rewards work, it would substantially weaken work incentives. Due to our paper, this point has now been widely recognized. We've received more pushback on the second question on how workers would respond to the reduced work incentive. But as I'll show in a minute, our assumptions here are supported by previous research. And therefore, the Build Back Better changes to the CTC would lead about 1.5 million parents to leave the workforce. Now, before we released our paper last fall, most experts held the view that the Build Back Better changes to the CTC would not affect the incentive to participate in work. Most prominently, a 2019 report from the National Academy of Sciences, or NAS, simulated the labor supply effects of a similar policy. However, that report failed to recognize that eliminating the pre-existing CTC would weaken the incentive to work. On the basis of the NAS report's conclusions, other simulations of the policy completely ignored employment effects. This error has heavily influenced the policy debate. For example, over 400 economists signed a letter to congressional leaders stating that the policy would lead to, quote, minimal work reduction. Poverty effects cited by the White House in support of the policy are inflated because they rely on studies that ignore the employment effects. All right, now let's return to the first question that I posed. How would the changes to the CTC under Build Back Better affect the incentive to work? This figure shows how the pre-existing CTC rewards work for a single parent with 2 children. If the parent doesn't work, she gets nothing from the CTC. But if she works and earns a little over $15,000 per year, then she receives $2,000 in CTC benefits. If she earns over $30,000, then she receives $4,000 in CTC benefits. This is a substantial reward to work. Build Back Better would eliminate this work reward and replace it with a flat child allowance that does not depend on earnings, This weakens the incentive to participate in work. Thanks to our paper, this point is now widely accepted. So this brings us to the second question. How many parents would stop working in response to the reduced incentive to work? To answer this question, we can turn back to the National Academy of Sciences report. While it did not model the CTC work incentive changes, it did simulate how a 40% increase in the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, would affect employment. The black line shows 40% of the EITC. As you can see, it has a similar work incentive as the CTC for parents earning up to around $20,000. But at higher levels of earnings, the CTC's work incentive is much stronger. The NAS report estimated that the black line would bring 0.8 million new single mothers into employment. Since the CTC work incentive is larger, it stands to reason that it brings a lot more than 0.8 million single mothers into employment. And thus, eliminating the CTC work incentive, as Build Back Better would do, should lead a lot of parents to exit employment. Now, in fact, we can calculate exactly how many workers would exit the labor force due to the CTC changes, simply using the values in the NAS report. As you can see in the first row of this slide, NAS assumed that a $1,000 increase in the reward to work would increase single mother employment by 5.6 percentage points. We estimate that the CTC changes would decrease the reward to work by around $2,000, highlighted in blue in the second row. Thus, the CTC changes would decrease single mother employment by about 11 percentage points, representing over 1 million single mothers. Adding in the income effect, which accounts for the employment decrease due to the child allowance portion of the CTC reform, we calculate that 1.3 million workers would exit the labor force. This assumes no response to work incentives among single fathers or married couples. Thus, NAS would have found that at least 1.3 million parents would have exited the workforce if it applied its methods consistently. So to conclude, I'll share the results of the paper that we actually wrote. In addition to recognizing how work incentives would change, a major innovation of our paper was our use of the Comprehensive Income Dataset, or KID, to simulate the proposed changes to the CTC. The KID overcomes income misreporting in surveys by linking individual tax records and government program data. It thus allows for a much more accurate simulation of employment and anti-poverty effects than relying on surveys alone. We used the KID to estimate work incentives faced by parents, and we applied elasticity estimates from the academic literature. We estimated that 1.5 million workers would exit the workforce. As I noted at the outset, employment effects of the CTC come down to two things: how work incentives change and how workers respond to the change in incentives. It is now clear that the Build Back Better Act changes to the CTC substantially reduce the incentive to work. And if we consistently apply work responsiveness estimates from previous research, we conclude that around 1.5 million parents would exit the workforce if these changes went into effect. With that, I'll wrap up, and I look forward to a discussion with the other panelists.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that's really useful context. So, when your paper came out in October, it made big waves because of its conclusions. And correct me if I'm wrong, but 1.5 million parents exiting the labor force represents or constitutes 2.6% of all working parents. We're also happy to have Jacob here because Jacob wrote a paper very similar in spirit to your own, but brought in some different assumptions. So and actually wrote a nice piece for us for our website that I'll be happy to link in the chat for participants here, sort of summarizing his findings. So Jacob, same question to you. What in your research, how do you think about the impact of the child tax credit on labor supply? And tell us a little bit about your paper as well.
Yeah, well, I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Sam, and everybody. I have a lot of respect for everybody on the panel, and I think it's a really important question. I think a lot of us are here because we want to design public policy that reduces poverty, but we're economists and we understand unintended consequences. We understand incentives matter. And so, we need to think rigorously about this. So I also do a lot of work on the Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit is another tax credit that also encourages work. So, the child tax credit before 2021 had this similar structure where if you didn't work, you didn't get any benefits. So if you didn't work, you don't get any earned income tax credit. You don't get any child tax credit. Once you start working, every dollar you earn can be worth, another 15 cents of CTC, or worth another 30 or 40 cents of EITC. And so, I believe work incentives matter. And I have a lot of research on the earned income tax credit showing that this has increased the employment of generally unmarried mothers, but has increased the employment of parents. So around the time when Kevin and Bruce and Matt and Derek was working on this paper, I hadn't done a lot of work on the child tax credit, but it was something that was getting a lot of attention, and it was something that I wanted to get into. So it took me a few months to get up to speed on kind of thinking about this topic, and so finally, probably about 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago, I came out with my paper. And in a lot of ways, it really agrees with a lot of the stuff that Kevin was talking about. So the child tax credit, it used to phase in with earnings. So if you didn't work, you didn't get any benefits. The Build Back Better version gives everybody child tax credit benefits. So it's fully refundable. And so even though that increased benefits for low-income families, and if you just kind of run a simulation and you add thousands of dollars to people's income, of course, it's going to pull a lot of people out of poverty. But because now it doesn't phase in with benefits, it's going to actually have this effect on people's tax rates, where it's going to have a reduction in the return to work. So in other words, it's going to raise people's average tax rates. Now, for the decision about how much to work, economists tend to think that marginal tax rates matter, whereas for whether to work or not, on the extensive margin, we think that average tax rates are more important. So because of the EITC, relative to a world without the EITC or the child tax credit, we still have an incentive to work for a lot of people. So, low-income family, their tax rate with the EITC was maybe negative 40%. And with the child tax credit on top of that, it might be negative 50%. So by changing the CTC, we've increased tax rates, but we've increased it. So it's like, for a lot of families, it used to be negative 40%. Now it's negative 30%. So we're still incentivizing work relative to a world without these tax credits, but it did increase the average tax rates, which, through the substitution effect and the income effect, which we can talk about, in more detail, this is going to likely lead to a reduction in employment. So I do think that it's going to lead to a reduction in employment. One of the questions is how much, and this is where, I believe reasonable people can have different ideas. I'm a labor economist by training, and I've done a lot of work, estimating elasticities, kind of not to really get into the weeds too much here. The assumptions that we put on what are the elasticities, basically we can project, okay, so this child tax credit change, maybe it's going to lead 300,000 people to stop working, 400,000 people, or, like Kevin said, 1 million or 1.5 million people. And so what assumptions we put in here, we kind of plug in our simulations, is going to have a big effect. And so, I do think that single mothers are more responsive on the extensive margin to some of these tax credits. So I do think that their elasticity is bigger than the, let's say a married couple, or, men in general, on average. And so, the elasticities that I assume are a little bit smaller than what Kevin and co-authors come up with. And so overall, instead of, 1.3 million, I estimate that about 450,000, 411,000 to be exact, workers would stop working. And this includes moms and dads, maybe a few grandparents and other guardians as well, but about 400,000 workers would stop working based on my preferred elasticities. And then, I'm running out of time, so I'll stop there. But, there's this whole other question of, even if this many people stop working, how many people are then going to be, fall into poverty? And this, I'd love to talk a little bit more later, but, kind of where I differ with their paper is I find that even in spite of these reductions in employment, the CTC would still have a big reduction in child poverty and in deep poverty. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jacob. So we've heard two different perspectives, a very similar approach, at least in spirit, in the kind of structural modeling that you guys are doing. There are some different assumptions that go into these models. With one set of assumptions, we hear 1.5 million potential parents dropping out of the labor force. With slightly different assumptions, we find 400,000 or so parents dropping out of the labor force or guardians. Turning to Elaine, what is your big picture overview of this question? Because obviously models, the famous saying in economics is you assume a can opener, right? So I would both love to get your big picture view of the impact of fully refundable child tax credits on labor supply, but also if it's not too much of a burden, we've heard some terms thrown out, including elasticity and marginal effects and things like this. If I'll pad your time a little bit if you're gracious enough to help define those terms for our audience.
So thank you so much for allowing me to join you here today. It's been really interesting to see all this work come out. I think the child tax credit has been revolutionary in what it's done. And I think there's a really, important question in front of us on whether we extend it or not. But if we just think about it in the context of work, I did want to sort of provide, a frame. So whether a person works or not is not entirely the function of whether there is a child tax credit or any tax credit with a high phase-in or not. Individual characteristics matter, right? Education, previous experience, disability status, race, sex. Is there someone else in the household? There's all these things that go into whether someone's working or not. And for parents, the choice is even more complicated. And in fact, sometimes there's no choice involved at all. You have a young child, do you have childcare? Does your child have some kind of special needs that require you to be there? There's reasons that people might not be working that aren't going to be changed with a tax credit. So, and the other thing is all of this research that sort of led up to this was concentrated when the world looked a little bit different than it does now. So fewer women were working. There were more jobs available. It wasn't such a tight labor market as it was, right in front of the pandemic, and I think what we expect to return to. So that also makes us think, all those assumptions we're making going into these models, we should question whether they really apply today. So there's this giant, spectrum of things influencing whether people work or not. And I would say that whether you get an additional 15 cents for every dollar you earn may play some role, but I don't think it's the primary driver of whether people are working or not. I want to think about also, so the EITC literature, I certainly agree with Jacob. There's this, effect that's been well proven and shown, but what we don't have to look back on in the literature is an example of what we're experiencing right now. So we had a credit, it changed, and what happened to labor supply. But we do have other examples of things going on. So there's an Alaska Permanent Fund, and people get, a fixed benefit, and we don't see people dropping out of labor force from that. Casinos opening, there's some work in that area, same thing, but we see some women working less or secondary earners. And then of course, there's the Stockton basic income experiments where people are, receiving these cash payments that I think look an awful lot like, a regular monthly child allowance type payment. And what we see there is people are working more. So I just want to lay that as a foundation for why we might think that neither Kevin's estimates or Jacob's are exactly right. That said, I did work with Jacob Golden and Kathleen Mickelmore, and our estimates of, people will leave the labor market in some cases, and we think it's closer to what Jacob's suggesting, so not a ton. But I don't want to let it go unquestioned of whether that's necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes people are leaving the labor market to perform jobs that we really want them to perform. So some work that was funded by Humanity Forward, Leah Hamilton and Stephen Roll were the primary authors I worked on, showed that when we asked people, what are you going to do with this money? 94% of them said they're going to continue working or work more. And so we wonder about that small share of people who might work less or drop out of the labor force. And not surprisingly, it's most likely parents with infants and parents with toddlers. And so we might think there's maybe just a small segment of the population that's more vulnerable to moving in or out of the labor force. We also heard from people who had a spouse or a partner at home, about 20% of them said the credit would be used to stay home more with children. So that might look like someone, working less or dropping out of the labor market, but they're performing this other activity, which we consider to be, pretty valuable in many cases. As far as the notion behind the models, the idea is that this income effect is we give you more income and it might change your preferences for things. So now instead of working as much, you might prefer a little more leisure. And then there's also a substitution effect working. So if I now only get $1 to go to work instead of $1.15, I might be less likely to go ahead and take that job. And those are the questions people are grappling with, though maybe we should note that people are not super confident about what's happening on the tax front, so they're not dialing in these things exactly. And then the elasticities that people talk about are just like, how likely is it? If there's a high elasticity, I'm very likely to respond to the incentive, and if I have a low elasticity, I'm not likely to respond. So I love my job so much, you can make it pay more, you can make it pay less, and I'm kind of inelastic. I'm just going to keep working at the Urban Institute. Or flipping burgers, and it's really it's not as fun, and people are mean to me. And so if I can get a little bit of an incentive to stay home, I might decide to drop out of labor market. So I'd have high elasticity there. And then the final work I wanted to mention is when we some work I did with others at Urban Institute, we asked TANF recipients, so very low income, typically single mothers, what do you think about these tax credits and working? And the answer is we want to work more, and they seem to be less influenced than we might have expected by all of these economic incentives. I'll turn it back to you.
You guys are keeping excellent time. So if I understand that right, Elaine, a few of the points you've made, one that potentially a 15-cent sort of marginal subsidy to your wages if you work is not something that is the primary driver of decisions, especially through the tax code, where there may be some information asymmetry is another word that comes up here, where people may not even be sort of hyper rational and aware. However, it is like the central dogma of economics that people respond to incentives. And one way to think of the word elasticity is just a fancy economist jargon for a number. It's a number that you put in your model that says for X amount of dollars, you get Y amount of an effect, and it sort of tries to quantify the incentive effect. Now, moving to Robert, I think there's a few things I'd love for you to pick on here, Robert, in your answer to the question, how does the child tax credit respond or impact labor supply? One is to pick up on Kevin's point that the National Academy of Sciences study here, regardless of what we think the right elasticity should be, treated the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit asymmetrically. So I'd be curious to hear your response to that. And the second point, sort of bridging off of Elaine's points, you've been following these debates from the welfare reform era to now, and have sort of seen the whole stretch of history. I would also just love to get your, almost retrospective view of how the debate has changed, how have your own opinions evolved on these topics, and the state of the research literature through that time, because research literatures and these estimates always evolve with better evidence.
Okay, well, sure. Thanks, Sam. And I will say something about the National Academy study. I'm not going to start off with that, but I will definitely answer your question and I'll talk about that. Let me, first of all, I want to thank Sam and the Niskanen Center for sponsoring this event. And I'm very happy to see the Niskanen Center emerge and become an important nonpartisan to Western Washington, which we desperately need more of. And so I'm looking forward to more activity in this country. Let me then also say that the other three panelists on here have all done very careful work on the effect of the CTIC and work that's in it. I have not. I've done something on National Academy. All three of these studies are better than what the National Academy did. We were doing some very back the envelope things, and I'll talk about that later. So I'm just a commenter here on what other people have done. I want to make that very clear. Secondly, I just want to echo Jacob. Every labor economist, based upon 60 years of research, believes there are work disincentives to almost all welfare programs. And I want to make that very clear. Nobody on National Academy or anybody I know would ever say there aren't any. So they are there, and a lot of people don't like to hear that, but they're non-zero. Okay. So as Jacob said, economists view this as a matter of trade-offs. How big are they, and what are the benefits? Is it worth doing it anyway? If we have time, I'd like to say a little bit more about the benefits. I think it's more than just reducing poverty, but I'll postpone that just to talk about work incentives. Okay, so the history of work disincentives. You're right, Sam. Done follow that for quite a long time, and I think there are three things we know. Okay, number one is it is shown that the responsiveness to work disincentives differs across types of people. Married fathers, married mothers and single mothers have different responses. And any study that's any good has to separate those. And what it always shows, all the literature shows, is that fathers respond very little to work incentives, almost, I won't say zero, but very small. Married women who have young kids in particular, very responsive to the child. They might want to stay home with their kids, and they will respond to welfare programs. My reading is that single mothers are kind of halfway in between those. Single mothers, after all, have to work because if they don't have any other income, they've got to support their kids somehow. So they're kind of like married men. On the other hand, they have kids, and so if they're given the opportunity to stay at home with their kids, they're very likely to take advantage of it. Jacob's estimates, some of the other estimates kind of differ on that. I think the earned income tax evidence is completely supportive of that traditional conventional wisdom. The EITC has almost no effect on men and fathers. It has a significant effect on married women who reduce their labor supply, and it has a significant effect on the positive effect on the single mothers. So they're kind of in between. So I think it's that very consistent. Second thing I look for a study is to recognize the elasticity of change. One thing to understand is that the single mothers in the 1980s and 1990s are not the single mothers of today. In the 1980s and 1990s, single mothers were almost never working. They were almost all on AFPC, and they didn't have good work incentives. We didn't have a very good EITC. Today, the majority of single low-income mothers work. Why? Because of welfare reform and the earned income tax credit. They are committed to the labor force to a degree they never work today. And this is supported if you look at the research. The research showed that the responsiveness of single mothers to welfare and other work incentives has dropped dramatically and is getting closer to that of men, which is very low. And the numbers, I'm not going to cite numbers because those are meaningless, but they've dropped really dramatically. And any study that doesn't recognize that also, I think, doesn't have very much credibility. Third thing to say is that we don't know much about the evidence of responsiveness for people up in like $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 of income, or much less than 100,000. All that EITC evidence we have, which may be the strongest evidence, is about families with incomes less than like 35 or 30,000. I would be very hesitant to make any guesses about how somebody with $100,000 of income, my priors is it's going to be very tiny. So when I look across the studies, I'm going to answer I thought your question, Sam, what is the number? I'm going to give you a number for the effect of the CTC on work effort. When I look at studies that distinguish married men from married women, which recognize the elasticities of single mothers have fallen, and number three, which don't make guesses about people who are making $100,000 a year. I think that a study that was stated by Jacob and a study that Elaine co-authored with a couple of other very good economists, I think are most reliable. And my seat of the pants guess is that the responsiveness is around 200,000 to 400,000 workers are dropping out. I'll give you that number, okay? I'll stick my neck out. In the middle, there's about 300,000. That's a guess. And I want to emphasize here, that these are guesses that we're all making. The problem is that we do not have any estimates to the effect of either the new ITC or the old ITC. There are no estimates of what direct estimates of the effect of the old EITC on labor supply. We don't even know. Okay, and some people are going to try to estimate the effects of the 2021. That's not going to work. It was a very different. So we're guessing here. A lot of uncertainty. I've told you where my bound is. So I'm going to stop there, and I have some. I'd like to address the bigger issues here about why we care and benefits and costs, but I'll postpone that hopefully a little bit later in the discussion. So turn it back to you, Sam.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I want to give Kevin a bit of a chance to respond here, and maybe if I can repackage some of these points. We've heard that elasticities, this jargony term, it just means how responsive you are to an incentive. And I like pizza. Maybe I'm assuming Jacob, Elaine, a lot of people like pizza, but the price of pizza goes up $1. I may eat a little bit less. Jacob might even eat a lot less. We all, in other words, we all have very different responsivenesses to incentives. And one of the challenges in modeling in economics is the need to generalize, right? So we, instead of giving every 340 million people in America a different elasticity, we have to pick demographic groups and assign to them different elasticities. So in your paper, you assign a higher participation elasticity to single parents because there's evidence to think that they systematically have a higher elasticity, so on and so forth. So I'd be curious to hear your response to the need to differentiate, because if I read Jacob's paper correctly, one of his critiques of your model has been that we are lumping together the decisions of fathers and mothers, even though we know that single mothers have much different responsiveness to these incentives than single fathers. And when you do that and make it a binary thing, either both parents drop out or neither drop out, that might affect your statistics.
All right, well, thank you. And yeah, thank you for all the other remarks from all the other panelists. Definitely very useful. So in terms of elasticities and sort of the responsiveness to work, so our paper does distinguish between single mothers on the one hand and all other workers. And the most pushback we've received is on the responsiveness among single mothers. We assumed an elasticity of 0.75. And that number is actually right in the range of what other people have said based on recent studies, a review by Austin Nichols and Jesse Rothstein in 2016, and a volume edited by Robert Moffett suggested 0.7 to 1.0. Another paper from Elaine and co-authors from September of last year pointed to that same range of 0.7 to 1.0. Bruce Meyer and I co-authored a follow-up research note where we looked at the elasticities from a bunch of recent papers, including a 2020 paper by Diane Schanzenbach and Michael Strain. And also our calculation was that they're at 0.85. Another paper from Hoynes and Patel, 2018, that was the NAS, was the basis of the NAS report. We calculated an elasticity of 1.25. So my understanding of the literature and the research we've done is that we are not assuming something too high. This is well within the mainstream of what people were saying.
So I'd like to understand the mechanics of the actual modeling process a little bit, Kevin. When you apply, so when you get the 2.6 million parents exiting the labor force, and if that's largely being driven by single parents, what proportion of that 2.6 million are single parents, single mothers, or is this just sort of applied to the population as a whole, and it's just a number that we sort of take?
I see. So 1.5 million, which is 2.6%. Right. Of all working parents. And so we are modeling the individual decisions of each worker. We calculate their return to work using the KID, highly accurate linked administrative and survey data. And we simulate how the reward to work would change under the new policy. And we apply an elasticity. I think the point that Jacob brought up, the dual labor supply decisions. Basically, we take single mothers on the one hand and simulate use the higher elasticity for them. And then we model dual earners together. And I think that's true that we do say either both drop out or neither do. And it's complicated to model dual label earners, and I think it's a reasonable approach to say we should model them separately. That said, when Jacob applies the same elasticities that we do, he gets something similar to our answer. And I would just follow up and say, the NAS report, again, also assumed an elasticity higher than us, given what we find. So they would have found at least 1.3 million workers dropping out of the labor force if they applied the same responsiveness to the CTC that they apply to the EITC.
So, Jacob, if I could turn to you, so there's some debate here around what the right elasticity is, but if I understand your paper correctly, you sort of produce a series of estimates, some with your preferred elasticity, but then others trying to replicate the Becker-Friedman Institute's methodology. And while you come to similar conclusions on labor supply, one of the takeaways I take it from your paper is that that doesn't necessarily translate into a reduced effect on poverty, right? So I think one of the big arguments with the Becker-Friedman Institute's paper was not only will this affect labor supply, but that will also eat into potential anti-poverty impact, because if people drop out of the labor supply, they have fewer earnings, and therefore we're losing ground on the war on poverty. So why does your approach come to a different set of conclusions?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So let me just kind of take a step back really quick, and the data I'm relying on and the data Kevin was relying on is different. So I'm not able to replicate exactly what they're doing. But with that said, I do try to decompose the results, because a lot of papers in this area, they kind of provide a headline number, 400,000, 1.3 million. And I try to decompose it into, unmarried mothers, married fathers, married mothers, and I try to look at that. And what I come up with is a little less than half of the overall employment effect is coming from unmarried mothers. About half, maybe about half is coming from unmarried mothers. And then about half of the employment effect is coming from married parents. Now you can assume different elasticities and get to, different numbers there. But, one of the areas that I do disagree with more so about, in assuming an elasticity is I assume a smaller elasticity on this participation margin, for married mothers and especially for married fathers, because, if you increase taxes for, the primary breadwinner by 10%, most of them still have to pay the bills. They're probably going to keep working. And we think that, most evidence suggests that elasticities on the participation margin for those primary breadwinners, especially married breadwinners, they're going to keep working. And so the elasticities are not quite zero, but close to zero. And so that's something that I show in my paper. The second point you brought up is how these employment effects translate to effects on poverty. So, employment is one variable that we care about. It's not the only variable we care about. I mean, if we wanted to maximize employment, we would remove all of retirement policies and Social Security and college, subsidies, right? I mean, clearly our goal in society is not to maximize employment. There's trade-offs everywhere. And so, an important aspect is to figure out, okay, this policy is going to affect employment, but maybe even more importantly is how is it going to affect poverty? Because if so many people stop working, that we actually have this giant unintended consequence that a bunch of people fall into poverty. Maybe they weren't poor before, but they choose to stop working and they fall into poverty. That could be problematic. So I try to decompose these results into, okay, are you currently working and poor, or are you currently not poor? And I try to look into, okay, based on these simulations, how many people weren't poor and they're going to become poor. And, if somebody was just above the poverty line, okay, maybe they were earning 25,000 a year, they fall into poverty. Okay, that's maybe, some people will do that. Now, if somebody was earning 70,000 a year, it might not be very plausible that many of them will drop out of the labor force to get, $9,000 in the child tax credit. So, when I do these simulations, I find that whether I use a bigger elasticity, the same ones that Kevin and his co-author use, or a smaller one, I still find a net positive effect on child poverty. The only question is, are we reducing child poverty by 22%, 30%, 35%? You know, are we reducing deep poverty by 30%, 40%? And really that's kind of the margin where, you know, how these employment effects translate into poverty. So the takeaway from what I find is, regardless of what you think the employment effect is, the impact on poverty is still big and, you know, basically an unprecedented decrease in child poverty.
That's very clarifying. We'll be turning to the audience Q&A soon. So if anyone has questions, be sure to get them in right now. Turning back to you, Robert, I promised you some time to sort of stretch your legs and talk about the bigger issues here. And I think this is a good opportunity to sort of piggyback on some of Jacob's points. You know, how should we think on a normative level about the labor supply decisions of married parents versus single parents? Is there a distinction here that matters from a social policy perspective? And I think bigger picture, there is this more conservative critique that we're too focused on just material resources, poverty as a function of lack of money, and maybe missing some of the deeper texture to what we care about.
Sure. So let me try to very briefly answer that. Let me first of all make kind of a related point about the National Academy study. The National Academy study was not as good as the studies we've talked about. It was basically simulating the effect on labor supply of a child care credit relative to nothing. And if you do that, all you get would be so-called income effects. We're not trying to be too technical here, so I won't go into that. And all the studies that I can see here show that these income effects are pretty small. So that's the way to think about the National Academy study. The second thing I want to just really throw out the National Academy study, which something, if you've read this report, you know that the Academy proposed, they thought that the child tax credit would reduce work incentives, and we proposed some other stuff that would too, expansions of SNAP and stuff, you know, lots of stuff reduced work incentives. We proposed that to be combined with some additional work incentives that would offset those and actually might even increase employment. Childcare subsidies, increase in the ITC. I think we got to think about packages here, that things that might reduce work incentives combined with things that were reduce work incentives. So what about the big picture, Sam, quickly? Let me say that I think that, like Elaine said, the big picture here is that we've got a lot of really low income single mothers, especially. They have much higher poverty rates than married couples. The married couples have two people and one of us is working. So we have some really low income people here. And what's the solution to the poverty problem? Myself, I've never believed that just like giving more money to non-workers is the long run solution. Long run solution to the poverty problem has to be to improve the skills and the kinds of jobs, you know, that these women are working at crummy jobs, flipping burgers. They have to travel all the way across town. They can't afford quality childcare. So you give them a little bit of money, they'll not work. They say, hey, I'm going to spend that time with my kids. Now I can afford to do that and not, you know, take these crummy jobs that are so onerous and so difficult. This long-run solution is not transfer, you know. This long-run solution is to enable women to get better jobs, be able to work more, and all those costs. So that's the trade-off side. I don't think it's just reducing poverty. And that's why I don't think money is the real metric. Is that people have the opportunity to live lives that fulfill them, and everybody wants to work. Low-income people want to work too. They are fulfilled. All the ITC literature says people are really happy when they can work and get the ITC. They value work. So that's at least my big picture comment.
Final question before we turn to Q&A for you, Elaine. One of the things I think I take away from what Robert just said was, you know, that you have to take this as a package and think about, you know, the full suite of programs that affect, in this case, female labor force participation, right? So, you know, one of the things that colors my views on this is, you know, observing what happened in Canada, where when we introduced a large child benefit, the single mother rate of labor force participation actually increased, sort of against the sort of expectations of just looking at what their return to work would be. But But when you dug into it, it was because they were able to use that money to afford childcare and had some sort of initial hurdles to getting into work. On that point, when you look across nationally, the US does sort of stand out in a relatively low employment rate among women, female labor force participation. At the same time, other countries around the world have programs like the proposed expansion to the child tax credit, but they also have other programs, right, that must also confound that and actually influence female labor force participation even more than these cash benefits are discouraging it. So from that big picture perspective, like what is the right package that we should be talking about here, and does it make sense to just talk about the child tax credit in isolation?
So the first comment is, I just want to respond briefly to Kevin's remark about a September version of a paper that I'm a co-author of. He's brought this up in multiple forums. His co-authors have. The paper has been revised, and I would direct people to, the most recent version of it. We receive criticism. We responded to that criticism. We learn, we grow, and it would be nice if this would not be a focal point in your discussion about your own work. As far as the package of how, more people move into work, what I would say is that cash is an essential part of that package, because the barriers that people face are many and they're varied. And so we will never be able to build enough programs to remove all the barriers, but cash allows people to remove their own barriers. Is it a transportation barrier? You can pay for that. Is it a childcare barrier? You can pay for that. And so I would say whatever the package of supports is, and I certainly don't disagree with, building up childcare or building up transportation or building up education, it should also include something that's fungible, because people, are very connected to their own lives and they know how to solve their own problems. And so my package would be a balance of things, but it would include some form of direct cash assistance.
Well, in our remaining 9 minutes, I think there's actually quite a few questions here. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them. And many of them have actually been responded in line by the folks that they're addressed to. But, top of the line, to Professor Corinth, I'm reading this from an anonymous participant. They write, can you think of a plausible scenario in which an impoverished parent making $11,000 a year will stop working because they get $6,000 in child benefits for their 2 kids? Can $6,000 alone sustain 2 kids? So this is a common argument I hear just in general, a kind of prima facie skepticism, like you can't live off the $300 a month that the child tax credit would provide. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, great question. So basically, we find only 2.6% of parents would drop out of the workforce. So that means 97% of parents would continue working. So this is a very small share of all parents who would stop, but that does add up to 1.5 million parents. I'd also just suggest that there are other benefits out there in terms of SNAP, food stamps, or SSI, disability insurance, especially for the kids program, Medicaid, WIC, school lunch. So there are housing assistance. So there are other benefits out there for families in poverty. But again, the vast majority of parents would not drop out due to this change incentive, but a small share likely would.
Following up on that, there's another question here asking about what were the effects of the change in the child tax credit in the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So for context to listeners, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doubled the size of the child tax credit from $1,000 to $2,000, but retained its phase-in. So in other words, it increased the work incentive for single parents and parents in general. Did we see, and this is for everybody, did we see a significant increase in labor force participation due to that child tax credit expansion?
I think Elaine should answer that based on her great work on this topic.
So there's the paper by Kai Leopold out there, right? And he sees some incentive, right? Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for this question.
I was referring just to your point that under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we did double the child tax credit. but we got rid of other provisions like the personal exemption for children that kind of canceled it out. So it actually wasn't that big of an increase in incentive. And I know Elaine had a great post on the Urban Institute that made that point, in which I found compelling. And just, Elaine, by the way, I don't mean to criticize your September paper. I actually thought you guys had it right there. It's just making the point that people have recently stated that that was the range of elasticities. So no, not trying to criticize that work at all.
Got it. So I do agree that, sorry, I misunderstood the question. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did essentially shuffle benefits around when it comes to families with children. And so, you know, very low income families got about $75 more from the change in where we began to phase the credit in. And middle income families were sort of left about the same, with a lot of caveats. It depends whether you're an itemizer, whether you have state and local taxes. And, you know, it was actually a very interesting net of changes.
There's another question here going back to the point about having a sort of package of reforms. And this is, you know, can child daycare programs or policies help with the labor supply decision? This asks in addition to the CTC, but yeah, my understanding of the international evidence is that obviously support for childcare has a very large impact on female labor force participation decisions. But at the same time, and I've sort of addressed this to Kevin, but I also get Rob and Jacob's perspective on this too. You know, in the context of sort of contemporary conservative politics, there is this debate around how do we best support families? Do we subsidize childcare? Do we just give parents cash? Right? The Senator Romney has a family security act, which is sort of a different kind of approach to child allowances. And so I see there's going to be some decisions to be made here. If labor force participation is the thing, should we be prioritizing subsidies for childcare and other sort of work supports?
I have something to say. So I'm a fan of giving families cash. And if they want to spend it on childcare, fantastic. And if they want to spend it on staying home or healthier food, now, I think there's a rationale for food stamps and kind of more in-kind benefits, but largely, you know, I think giving families the cash and then letting them spend it on things that they want. Again, I don't think I'm not in favor of throwing away the entire safety net and just giving people you know, some cash. But you know, kind of my tiebreaker generally goes towards cash versus you know, something more in kind.
I would slightly disagree in that I think there's a strong economic rationale for childcare subsidies simply because it's a work-related cost. And so there is some rationale towards at least some amount of childcare, such as through the child independent care tax credit or flexible spending accounts for kids to have some offset of the childcare cost that parents face.
I'll just say I'm with Lane here, you know, which is you need the balance, you know, you need some cash, you know, because right now, if you don't work today and you're poor, you're going to get SNAP and you will get Medicaid, and that's about it. Okay. And no other price. And you can't eat Medicaid and you can't pay the rent with Medicaid. You can't, you know, they need some cash for certain needs. At the same time, you just got to have a balance. You've got to have the child care and subsidies there. You know, you've got to have a good EITC that rewards you for work, and you've got to support food and medical care. So it's getting the right package, and it's as much of an art as a science, you know, to get that right. And I'm sure people will differ. And I should say, my view of the conservatives, by the way, there are some people who put a lot of high value on mothers staying home with kids when they're young. And not working, and I don't know where to factor that in. Maybe Kevin could comment on that.
Yeah, in our final minutes, I would love to get everyone's reaction to that concept, especially piggybacking on another question from the audience. This question asks, how does administration matter here? Has monthly or annual disbursements made a difference? So both reacting to that in our last moment, and also, you know, is there a distinction here to be made between really young children? Should maybe cash for brand new parents or children of 0 to 1? Is that something that should be treated differently than sort of cash for 0 to 17 or 18?
I'll just touch on the monthly versus annual distribution. I think there's a big debate that's happening right now. We don't know the answer yet, but it was pretty compelling to me when we started delivering the child tax credit as a monthly payment. We watched food insecurity amongst families with children drop very quickly, which felt like a meaningful response. I tend to think there's some balance between, wanting a lump sum and monthly payments, but I do think if we're going to shove so much of our safety net into the tax system, people are getting, a quarter of their annual income in one payment, that we're possibly doing a disservice to people, and giving them access to this money throughout the year might be more beneficial, particularly if you want to use it to pay for childcare or transportation or recurring needs.
Kevin, you get the last word, and I specifically love for your thoughts on, especially this point about, spending time, a parent spending time with their child that might come at the expense of work. But in that first year, do you think that's a trade-off that might be worth making?
Yeah, and that I certainly think it's very valuable for parents to spend time with their kids. I also know in the experience from welfare in the 90s that requiring and rewarding work did seem to have positive impact for kids, especially due to the EITC's benefits on children. And just on the monthly annual piece, the current CTC, the non-refundable portion, is a tax credit, and effectively that is provided throughout the year because it reduces your tax burden. But yes, agree, for the non-refundable portion, or if you made this fully non-refundable, you could think about, if that was your goal, you could think about monthly disbursements.
Well, thank you. I think this has been an enlightening discussion all around. I work on this issue for my day job, and I learned quite a bit nonetheless. So thank you all for participating, and anyone who joined late and would be interested in seeing the whole event, we'll have it posted to our YouTube channel within a day or two, and you can find it also on our website. And please visit the Niskanen Center's website for all kinds of analysis on this issue, family economic security, but also our other issue areas like immigration and climate change. And thank you.
Thank you, Sam.